Please welcome Nora and Angel to the stage.
Hi, Angel.
Hello.
So we've been talking for the last couple of days about how to refashion creative industries for a digital era. And you and I are going to talk about physical revitalization, but how that's actually interleaved with digital as well, and how they have a lot to say to each other and to inform each other. So first I want to start talking about this urban renewal project called Rosa Parks, which is going on in Detroit. Might seem at first like a little bit of a sidestep for you because you have this whole background in digital media. But first of all, can you tell me about, just briefly, paint me a little picture of this neighborhood in Detroit, which is called Corktown.
Yep. So Corktown, I think, is a really interesting neighborhood for a variety of reasons, but essentially it's the oldest neighborhood in Detroit. It was originally an Irish immigrant neighborhood, and today and over time it's changed dramatically, and it's changed in a lot of different ways. So essentially what you see today is a really interesting mix of people. So there's, largely an African-American population, so it's, predominantly a black part of town. And you've got, it basically borders kind of Mexican Village and the big, rapidly growing Latino community who've been there over time. So then you've got a really great mix of the Latino and Hispanic community there. And then what you're starting to find, because, as you can imagine, property prices are so low, you've got a lot of either primarily artists, but you've also got some kind of young, hipster folks in the suburbs who want to have a kind of more urban lifestyle, so they're starting to move in. So you've got a really interesting mix of different communities, in this one neighborhood. And some of the other interesting aspects of that particular neighborhood, I mean, it's, all of the images that I'm sure many of you have seen on the New York Times or lots of other, publications, where you just see, just despair. You can see very vividly in Corktown, but then you'll see, a single street which are just the most exquisite, homes in fantastic condition, where the homeowners obviously have a great sense of, pride and are investing in these homes in their community. And yet it was where the old Detroit Tigers Stadium used to be. So when they moved the stadium only a few blocks down the road, the new stadium's fantastic at Comerica Park, but they tore down the old stadium, which I personally think was a big mistake. But a lot of the people who were coming into the city then just moved over a few blocks, and it really kind of decimated the neighborhood. So now there's a new restaurant in town, in the neighborhood in Corktown called Slows. It's basically a very kind of ambitious entrepreneur. It's just a little barbecue restaurant, but because it's so popular, people are coming from all over Detroit and from the suburbs into Corktown. Corktown's one of the places that a lot of people felt unsafe to visit. And so there weren't a lot of retail businesses, restaurants, a lot of those kind of went away. So because this one restaurant is actually starting to make a real difference, the other thing that I should probably mention in terms of its evolution over time is in the center of Corktown was the Michigan Central Depot. So it was the big train station. So it's probably the most iconic building in Detroit. But it's been derelict for, since the early to mid 80s, and it's still a beautiful building. So you'll have people, traveling just to come see this, this building. And my business partner is just on the development deal, so there is going to be kind of, activity there now. But what you saw is just these magnificent buildings and no people.
So what's your vision for Rosa Parks then?
The vision is really to convert it from what is, I considered it Corktown, a urban ghost town, in effect. The vision for Rosa Parks is to really start to look at physical spaces in an entirely different way. So, So a lot of my work in social media has been around, building and enhancing consumer experiences around communities of interest. So for me, this is now taking that into the physical world. So with Rosa Parks, essentially what we're trying to create is a space. It's about 100,000 square feet is one building. We're also acquiring other properties. In this 100,000 square feet, we have event space, office space, and we're creating retail space. So essentially what we want to do is we really want to build up local entrepreneurship and to support local entrepreneurship. And a lot of that is by having very flexible and affordable space. But it's also about creating events programming and resources that the community who already lives in that neighborhood can benefit from. So what we don't want to do is we don't want to take a lot of the big multinationals and put them in there, and that would be great from a pure profit standpoint. And we've had a lot of those approaches, and they are hard to reject sometimes. But what we're trying to do is really just we're basically talent scouting. We're going around, we're meeting lots of different businesses, lots of different individuals, and we're trying to pick the key ones who we think will really influence the way that Corktown itself, the entire neighborhood, can evolve over time. The grand vision is that Detroit itself will be able to eclipse its former heyday status, and I think Detroit was once the Silicon Valley. It was about acceleration, velocity, iteration, in the automotive industry, obviously, and that was largely based on engineering talent and I think creative talent. And a lot of the same words could be applied to Silicon Valley today. So I'm hoping with this project and with some of the other projects that we're focused on, and taking a more kind of sensitive triple bottom line approach, that we can hopefully just revitalize the entire city by looking at one neighborhood and having maximum impact in that neighborhood.
So you're trying to crack two very tough nuts here. One is the urban renewal thing, and the other thing is the long sought after creative cluster next Silicon Valley, whatever buzzword you want to use. So I'm curious about what strategies you're going to use, and in particular what you've learned from your experience in creating online communities that you can bring to this physical instantiation.
Sure. So one of the reasons that Detroit has struggled, in my view, is because there are a lot of speculators who go in, buy these great spaces, these great buildings, and then they do nothing with them. They just sit on them, and they're waiting. They're playing the long game. They're paying, when the market really, picks up again, then they'll sell. But basically, what that means is you have lots of abandoned buildings, and they're in terrible shape, and there's lots of liabilities around them. The positive side of that is, when thinking about these, I won't use the expletives when these people who don't care about communities, I think what they're doing is they're creating demand for spaces like ours. So for example, when the Huffington Post were opening up, their Detroit branch, they really wanted to be in Corktown because they can see that it's a community that's really rich in the sense of this diversity that I mentioned, also rich in terms of its potential. And so, so we had space because there's actually no other space that would accommodate, their requirements. So some of these speculators are really, I think, creating opportunities, at least for us right now. And I think, when I was talking about identifying, who we could really work with in terms of trying to create the kind of vision that, that we're developing, is we wanted to really have tenants who shared a similar vision, in terms of, revitalizing, a city, but also who share this vision that, work, play, living generally is really rapidly changing. And so what all those things mean, what your day-to-day life is like now is very different than what it used to be. So how I translate that to, to what I've been doing over, the last 20 years is really building communities of interest, right? And so a lot of, what what we've done, or what I've done at, at Bibo or in South America with Sonico or, these other properties, is that initial seeding. You try to identify who are the influencers that are really going to help grow your community, right? And so we're doing that in the physical sense. We're meeting up with other people that we think if they come on board, if they come into our space, they are really going to send that general message and attract other like-minded businesses and individuals. So far it's working, and it's, and there's a lot of buzz. And just yesterday, day before yesterday, we acquired another really, really unique property. Both properties are incredibly unique, but this one is these dome buildings from Jack White's brother, and you have this crazy city where there's this like enormous musical talent and enormous engineering talent. And so I think in terms of creating these clusters, which is again a large part of what I've done in the digital world, it's not so dissimilar. But the part that I think is really exciting is that that physical connection really kind of reinforces on a really emotive level the kinds of relationships that you're enhancing and developing in the digital world. That connection of actually bringing these people together is, I just think, incredibly exciting.
Yeah, because it seems to me that a lot of what you've thought about has to do with focusing on user experience and having rich user experiences. So, I mean, and that factors in two ways in this case, because there are the people who are going to be working there, and there are also the people from who you hope to have come and visit and hang out and buy things and whatnot. So how does your user experience perspective factor into this?
That's an excellent question. So what I think is super challenging, but also just, I don't know, what I'm really passionate about is just innovation. For me, it's, it doesn't necessarily have to be, just about music or just about media or technology. I'm really passionate about innovation. So when we're looking at, these projects, and we're looking at, okay, well, our physical proximity, we happen to be located on, one of the, I think it's the biggest international trade border into Canada, right? Most people don't think of Detroit that way, then they don't think of that particular location that way, but it is. And so I think that, so the way that we're thinking about really global communities and local communities, for me, is coming from a digital mindset, right? So I think about it in the sense of, let's just say, right now we're trying to develop this retail complex within these properties, and it forces me to think, okay, well, what is an optimal retail experience now, right? Because before, websites were basically the marketing window, and then you went into the shop and you bought your things there, right? And then obviously we're all very aware that a lot of transactions have moved to pure digital or online transactions. So what does that mean for the physical retail, presence? So, I think, in a lot of ways that physical retail presence now is the marketing window into the online transaction. So if that's the case, or if, for certain types of retail experiences that's the case, then again, what does that mean for the consumer? Because consumers still want to go out, they like experiences, in terms of going out and doing things, entertainment, whatever, retail. So I think in some ways what it means is I'm looking at how we develop the actual space and the types of businesses that we're bringing in is, do these retail spaces now just become, for example, showcases? Do they become, where it's like click and collect, like, you're in there, you're like, okay, I love it, and, then are you actually, capturing that impulse moment where they want to buy it, right there? Or are they researching it online and they don't want to wait 2 days for it to arrive, so they're actually going to pop down to the shop? So do they become distribution centers? Do they become customer service centers? Okay, I'm having a problem, with my whatever. Can I go back to that particular, even though I bought it online, can I go back to that shop and have it dealt with there? So a lot of the things that that we're really thinking about, we're able to think about because we're going into a city that just has loads and loads and loads of abandoned buildings, and and it still has some people living there, but it's the only city in the U.S. that has shrunk, right, in terms of the actual city lines. It's been completely redesigned. So I'm trying to think about different ways to reverse the migration trend. So instead of people moving out, people moving back in, and what you need to do to enhance a retail experience, to enhance a working environment. So in the working space, there are companies that we have like Curved, which is an internet retail business. We have a school. It's a Head Start program in the building. What are the things that we can do that will complement and enhance the actual physical experience? And like I say, all of that for me is coming really from a digital perspective. And I think most of I guess you could say I'm a property developer now. I don't really consider, I consider it community development. But I think a lot of the people in that space that are doing, that are buying up buildings and trying to populate those buildings, they don't have my kind of background. I think they're not really coming at it from the perspective of these really rapidly changing ways of working and living and consuming, et cetera. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to create some true innovation in terms of the incubation of these new kinds of businesses. Even when we're talking about this shared workspace, it's about how do you design a space where you want to encourage collaboration, and that's what I think this, transmission is amazing, because it really is about, sharing ideas and collaborating to make an impact in our industries, right? But what types of events or what types of actual space will inspire that collaboration? Like we were just talking about trust in our breakout session, and I was like, trust? Like, how is that possible? I couldn't even get into the metadata detail conversation that we were having, because I was just still focused on trust. And I think amongst competitors, that's a very difficult thing to do. But I don't know. I think obviously, if I'm somebody who's going in and spending all my money in Detroit, I believe in the impossible.
So, there are a lot of people here, obviously, who are involved in, various aspects of online media and so forth. So, if we're starting to see this blending of the virtual meeting the real, and this kind of overlaying of the two, we see all the time through things like meetup culture, how much people want to extend the virtual experience into bricks and mortar, whatever you want to say, and vice versa. So, what would you say to them in terms of how they might be thinking about working with physicalizing what they're doing in the digital area?
Well, I think, I do believe that one of the big macro trends right now is the digital virtual worlds meeting the physical worlds. And I don't mean just like, people not buying CDs and people buying, digital downloads, or how you do that at events, et cetera. I mean it more in the sense of people actually wanting to meet up in some way. So, and some of it has to do with game theory or actual gaming experiences. Like if you think about the evolution of Foursquare and whatever. But so I think that a lot of what we need to now consider are some of the other trends that have been taking place in digital, and I think some of those are really about an increased level, and I'm going to use that word, trust, in terms of what people are willing to say or convey about themselves. And Bebo, some of the stuff that these younger kids would share on their profiles, sometimes it was just frightening. I thought, there's no way to really erase this, But so I think that also the sense of identity. So people, more so now than before, are using their real identity. For me, that is a huge signal that people want to connect those physical or real relationships in digital platforms, but also in real life, right? Because they want to tell people who they are. If we look at the way that blogging has, exploded, what we saw very early on were, really blogs, that were titled by interest and whatnot, and a lot of times people didn't even expose their names. And now, people want to be celebrities in their own rights by having a really popular blog. And so, so I think that some of the things that we need to think about when we're thinking about user experiences, like if you talk to, most, most people working on, UI or, UE more generally, they're very specifically thinking about the design, right? Or the presentation layer, or the navigation that the user will go through. And what I'm talking to a lot of developers about now, and a lot of the, the big companies and some of the smaller companies is, okay, we have to really start thinking about user experiences. What are they doing digitally and what are they doing in the physical world? And you can't, the innovation is really going to come when you start to look at the individual more holistically rather than what is their specific experience on this particular website or in this particular app. What is that person doing throughout their entire day or their week or whatever, and where are they going and who are they meeting with, and how can we enhance that digital experience or that physical real world experience by interpreting that data in a more meaningful way.
Yeah. And I mean, as I think Bill Buxton pointed out yesterday in conversation with Michael, I mean, there are values that underlie that, right? That's what you choose to support. If you're choosing to support community underneath that, it's not just a technical solution. There are values that lie underneath that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, some of the things that, that we've looked at, I'd say like probably the closest analogy to what we're doing in Detroit is something in a pure physical sense to like a Spitalfields in London or, or something like that. And, but even those developments, or those properties haven't really embraced, I think, the values I think are transparent and they've changed a bit since obviously the corporate takeover and the minimizing of the market there in Spitalfields. But, but I think that those values are very transparent in the physical world. You can really tell the difference, right? If you're going into, a mall that has, Starbucks and, and all the kind of top brands versus something where you see local designers, et cetera. And obviously digital gives a whole nother level of transparency, and it gives global transparency, right? So for example, we've been thinking about, okay, well, if we're really trying to build the local economy, increase the tax base, build local businesses, then what are the ways that, a lot of these guys, the mom and pop shops or whatever, are not going to be able to build out fully digital transactional services for their businesses, right? Mm-hmm. And, and they're just really trying to deal with the face-to-face relationships with their customers. But can we then bring the technology overlay through, through my network, through our relationships, where they can have digital storefronts, for themselves, and then all of a sudden have a global audience? Right. And so there are definitely ways that I think, we can, I guess, be true to the vision and the values that we have in terms of really trying to, not from a pure incubator standpoint, because a lot of those exist already, but help to incubate and accelerate the growth that's already taking place. Mm-hmm. By combining really the digital expertise either that we have in the building or that we have globally, and work with local people to make that happen. And part of that is reskilling. We've got a massive, I started to talk to some of our tenants about like life cycle learning. I'm not an expert in education by any stretch of the imagination, although I've got so many degrees that I feel like maybe that's actually what I'm good at. But I think that like we've got the Head Start program where we have kids who are 18 months, right? Mm-hmm. And it goes up to, to kind of about 5-6 years old. And then, so when we were looking at, okay, well, what should the events programming be? Because we want to work with the community. And I'm saying, okay, well, we need to work with, all these laborers and either reskill these laborers or offer them additional tools to do their craft, and also the engineering talent that I mentioned, and then a load of creatives that have always come from Detroit and who are now coming to Detroit because other cities have become so expensive. Right. How do we develop a whole program where all of those people can benefit? So if, for example, it's about creating new products, you're literally working with, an 18-month-old through to, a 60-year-old in terms of an educational programming schedule or curriculum that will benefit each one of those individuals that participates in that. And again, using digital platforms and that physical space.
Right. Can we talk just very briefly at a sort of 30 stories up level, what you're observing in terms of just the way that the physical and the digital are connecting and the way hardware and software are connecting and so forth?
Yeah, okay, so I have a couple of different hats, right? And most of the entrepreneurs in here obviously do as well. So, so I'm still working very closely with companies like Sonos, who I'm a huge fan of. And yes, of course, in our properties, we've got Sonos everywhere. And developing their partnerships with companies like, Spotify and Pandora and Slacker, who are here, who I'm a big fan of, and lots of other DSPs. But I think one of the things that, especially over the last day, has become incredibly transparent is just, we've been talking for a long time about disruptive technologies. But it's not just disruptive technologies. I think what we're seeing in terms of the physical and the digital is that some of the pure digital players are now getting very much into the physical space, right? And some of the more physical players, or whether that's hardware, physical space, whatever, are getting more into the digital services side. So, so for example, with Google's announcement, or at least the coverage about them developing hardware for in-home, entertainment, music experiences, obviously following their Google Music launch in Android. It's one of those areas where you see, one of the big, digital behemoths now getting into consumer products, actual physical products. And so, that move, if they are successful, could be incredibly, disruptive to what we were calling the disruptive businesses, like, whether either that's Jawbone or some of the new wireless speakers that are coming out. It's even disruptive to companies like, let's say, Bose or, et cetera. So I think that I see that we're at a really interesting stage in that continuum, and I think that that's going to continue to grow in terms of, the digital services that are starting to get more into physical products. I mean, even if you look at, for example, Angry Birds, Angry Birds were very, very, Rovia were very, very kind of quick to get into that physical product space, in terms of their, their licensing, et cetera. And so I think that part of this merging as well, not just the communities, but actual product is really at an interesting stage, and I just see it growing exponentially over the next few years.
We're just about out of time, but we've talked a lot about what it would mean to reimagine creative industries for a new digital era. Do you think that there are sort of final lessons from reimagining post-industrial physical cities for the creative industries?
Yeah.
Just an easy question to end.
Yeah, I know, my brain's not that big, especially not after last night. I think it's a tough one, and I think people smarter than me will be able to answer it better. I'm hoping that through my personal investment, both in in capital, time, commitment, et cetera, that I'll come up with some good solutions that apply to to one neighborhood, to one city, with that kind of global outreach, that could potentially serve as a model for other places. And I'm constantly looking at other towns. We were talking about Hamilton, the other day, and how there are a lot of synergies in terms of, what's happening there. I think in terms of, creative clusters, I've been viewing them, as kind of existing, we were just kind of getting to a stage on the internet, right, where these creative clusters were spanning geographical boundaries, right? And I think that's just hugely exciting, and I love the thought of people all over the world being able to collaborate on a project. But there are actually very few examples of huge success stories where that creative cluster in a pure digital sense has come out with some real knockout success. There are a few. I think, it is still very much in those, physical spaces, whether it's, on a day-to-day basis or whether it's, on a more kind of, regular basis, but not day-to-day, that physical working together, the spontaneity, et cetera. There is something about that does build up these new kind of, world-class innovations. So I think that what we should be able to do is start to see what those new methods will mean in terms of how we do it. So I don't think you need to be together on a day-to-day basis, physically. I do think you need to be connected because, you need to be able to communicate, whenever that moment of inspiration, comes or that solution to the problem comes. But I think we'll start to just see a lot of answers come out of new experiments, like we're doing, in Detroit. I think we'll start to see some things that just work for certain creative clusters that just don't work for other creative clusters. So I also think that we're going to start to see many more kind of merging of mediums. So, so I think for a long time, music really felt like it was special. And I think maybe we all still like to think, we're special. But, I've had a games company before that's done, that was very successful, still is successful in the UK. And when I went into that business, I was like, well, how is that different than TV? And how is that different than music? And, then when I got back into TV and then I was doing radio, and I thought, for me, I guess maybe I'd look at it on a kind of very macro level, but I think we're starting to see some of these creative clusters really just crossing different, different formats, different mediums. And I think that's when we're going to start to see some really, really exciting stuff, like with social games, moving more into the space of how do you actually improve health and well-being, right? And so I think really that cross-industry fertilization amongst creative clusters and pure kind of technology clusters, et cetera, that's the space I'm really excited about. I think that we'll start to see some of those big answers when there's greater merging of different types of creative clusters. Some of the problems that we're trying to solve in here right now have been solved in other industries. And, a lot of it is just the pure human element of, I don't want to work with them. I don't want to work with them. And those are legacy, human issues. Digital doesn't change that. Physical doesn't change that. We change that by changing our minds, by believing in the impossible and actually doing it.
Angel Gambino, thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.